My dad suddenly cut me off after he became ill. His new wife made him do it. I found out the shocking reason why through her son. So together we publicly ruined her life. My mom passed away while giving birth to me, so naturally my dad and I are extremely close. Growing up, he was my superhero. The kind of dad who worked double shifts and still made it to every school play I had. I'd wake up at dawn to him dressed like a princess, throwing me a costume telling me it was Disney watching day. Even when I got bullied at school and the principal refused to lift a finger, my dad marched right in, and being 6'6" and 250 pounds, scared the principal into solving the problem. He always told me, no matter what happens, kiddo, I'll always be in your corner. That promise held strong into my later stages in life, and even through my divorce 3 years ago. Dad drove for 14 hours straight just to help me pack boxes and hold my hand. But then something happened last year. He called me out of the blue last year, casually dropping the news that he'd been diagnosed with Parkinson's. I felt like someone punched me in the gut. He kept saying it was mild, nothing serious yet, but I couldn't stop worrying. Even worse, 2 weeks later, he stopped picking up my calls altogether. I couldn't stand it. I booked a flight to Arizona right away, hoping maybe he was just embarrassed or something. But when I got there, he was different, not even looking at me. And Diane, this woman he'd barely been dating a few months, hovered over him like some guard dog. My dad barely let me say hello before he coldly told me I was negative and draining. I asked him what he meant, and he said he needed positive energy around him right now because of his illness, and that meant staying away from me. It hurt so much I could barely breathe. I didn't understand where it was coming from. I tried asking him to elaborate, but Diane stepped in, warning me that emotional scenes would worsen his condition. I left his house feeling empty. The next 8 months were brutal. Every text I sent went unanswered, so I went to therapy and learned to cope. Eventually, mutual friends dropped the bomb to me that Dad had married Diane. He even started calling her son Connor his own. Seeing pictures on social media made it worse. He looked drained, pale, and nothing like the vibrant man who raised me. Then out of nowhere, almost a year later, after I had learned to accept it, Connor called me sounding anxious and scared. I'd never even met him, but he sounded genuine enough that I listened. Connor told me Diane had been isolating my dad from everyone who cared about him. She convinced him that his Parkinson's would eventually make him a burden to me. That's why he cut contact with me. What's worse, Connor found out she'd taken over my dad's finances, changed his will, and even controlled his phone and emails. He'd overheard her talking to lawyers, making plans to put my dad in a care facility once she finished transferring everything. But the moment that broke my heart was when Connor mentioned how Dad kept a photo of me hidden in his desk drawer. Connor caught him looking at it sometimes when Diane wasn't home, crying softly. He asked my dad one day while Diane was out of the house about the photo, and my dad just said he's already burned the bridge with me, there is no going back, and that Diane is probably right about the fact he'd be a burden to me with his illness. That's when Connor knew he had to tell me what was going on. I was so angry. I remember asking Connor to gather proof of Diane's manipulation, and he did. He recorded their conversation and captured just how evident her scheme was. So together, me and Connor made a plan. We found an elder law attorney who confirmed we had enough proof to step in. I drove over to confront Diane. As soon as she opened the door, she tried to send me away, but Connor was there. He pulled out his phone and started playing the recordings. She looked at him in shock and started yelling about how her own son betrayed her. My dad just sat there frozen, listening to the recording, eyes wide with shock. Diane kept trying to cut in, yelling at Connor that he was a traitor, yelling at me to leave, but we didn't budge. Finally, I got down on my knees in front of Dad. I reminded him of how he filled the role of both parents and made my childhood special, and I reminded him of the promise he always made me. I told him it was my turn to promise him, I'll always be in your corner too, Dad. I'm not leaving this time. He broke down, finally looking at me again, tears streaming down his face. He confessed he'd pushed me away because Diane made him terrified that he'd ruin my life if I had to take care of him. He'd believed her lies because he loved me so much that becoming a burden was his biggest fear. I left the house with him that day, promising he could stay at mine. Connor left too. But this situation was far from over. Over the next few days, me and Connor decided to document everything. He started by taking pictures of Dad's living conditions at Diane's house, the locked medicine cabinet, and screenshots of all the financial records he could find. The divorce process started quickly. Dad's lawyer, Taylor, was shocked when I showed her the evidence of financial abuse. Diane had been transferring money from Dad's accounts to hers for months. She'd also put her name on his house deed without his full understanding. Taylor assured us we had a strong case. Diane didn't go quietly. She showed up at my apartment 3 days after Dad moved in with me. She pounded on the door and screamed that I was stealing her husband. My neighbors called the police, who made her leave but couldn't do much else. Connor stayed with us that night, worried his mom might come back. The court hearings were exhausting. Dad's Parkinson's symptoms got worse with the stress. His hands shook more, and sometimes he had trouble finding words. I took time off work to drive him to appointments and court dates. Connor testified against his own mother, telling the judge how she'd isolated Dad and controlled his medication. I could see how much it hurt him to do this, but he knew it was right. After 3 months, the judge ruled in Dad's favor. Not only did he get his house back, but Diane had to return all the money she'd taken plus interest. She was left with only her personal belongings and her car. The look on her face when the judgment was read still haunts me. Pure hatred directed at me. We thought it was over. We were wrong. Diane started a campaign to ruin our reputations. She told everyone at Dad's church that I was after his money. She contacted my workplace and told my boss I was stealing Dad's medication to sell. My boss, Jordan, didn't believe her, but it was embarrassing to have to explain the situation. Then she targeted Connor. She told his girlfriend that Connor had serious mental problems and a history of violence. The girlfriend, Casey, almost broke up with him until he showed her all the court documents. Casey became one of our strongest supporters after that. Dad's health continued to decline. 6 months after moving in with me, he needed a walker full-time. His neurologist, Dr. Susan, adjusted his medications, but the disease was progressing faster than expected. Connor visited almost daily, helping Dad with exercises and bringing him books about classic cars, which they read together. Diane found new ways to harass us. She created fake social media accounts in my name and posted horrible things, making it look like I was neglecting Dad. I had to contact the platforms to get the accounts removed. She sent packages to our house. Once it was a box of dead flowers with a note saying, "This is what happens to thieves." The police couldn't do much since she was careful to stay just within legal boundaries. Officer Reese suggested we file for a restraining order, which we did. The judge granted it, but Diane found ways around it. She'd park just beyond the legal distance from our house and watch us. She'd send friends to check on Dad, who would then report back to her. Connor was amazing through all of this. He stood up to Diane whenever she tried to manipulate him. Once, she pretended to be sick to get him to come over, then tried to convince him I was drugging Dad. Connor recorded the conversation and showed it to her, telling her he wouldn't visit again if she kept lying. It worked for a while. A year after the divorce, Dad fell and broke his hip. The surgery went well, but recovery was difficult with his Parkinson's. I hired a part-time nurse named Alex to help when I was at work. Dad hated needing more help, but eventually bonded with Alex over their shared love of old movies. Diane somehow found out about the fall and showed up at the hospital. She told the staff she was still his wife and almost got into his room before Connor arrived and set things straight. The hospital increased security after that incident. As Dad got weaker, Connor and I talked about moving him to a care facility. We visited several places but couldn't find one that felt right. Dad overheard us discussing it and became upset. He didn't want to be stored away, as he put it. We promised to keep him home as long as possible. 2 years after Dad moved in with me, Diane made her boldest move. She filed a lawsuit claiming Dad wasn't mentally competent when he divorced her, and that I had manipulated him. Her lawyer, a sleazy guy named John, demanded new medical evaluations. Dad had to endure hours of questioning by doctors and lawyers. The stress caused his symptoms to worsen dramatically. He developed pneumonia shortly after and had to be hospitalized. Connor and I took shifts staying with him, afraid Diane might try something. The judge threw out Diane's case after Dad's longtime doctor testified about his mental clarity, despite his physical limitations. Diane was ordered to pay our legal fees. She left the courthouse screaming that we would regret this. 3 days later, someone slashed my tires. We couldn't prove it was Diane, but Connor installed security cameras around my house the next day. The footage caught Diane trying to break in through the back door a week later. This time, the police arrested her for violating the restraining order. She spent 2 nights in jail before being released on bail. The conditions of her release included staying at least 500 feet from us and wearing an ankle monitor. For the first time in years, we felt some relief. Dad's condition continued to deteriorate. By the 3rd year, he needed help with most daily activities. Connor moved into my spare bedroom to help care for him. We developed a routine. Connor handled mornings before work, Alex came during the day, and I took evenings and nights. Diane's ankle monitor was removed after 6 months of compliance. Within a week, she started sending letters to Dad, begging forgiveness and claiming she still loved him. Dad read the first one, then asked us to throw away any others that came. As Dad approached his 70th birthday, he became more reflective. His speech was now difficult to understand, but he worked hard to tell us stories about his life before Parkinson's. He made me promise to live fully and not spend my youth caring for him. I promised, even though I had no intention of placing him in a facility. We celebrated his birthday quietly at home. Connor brought a small cake, and Alex joined us after their shift. Dad managed to blow out the candles with help. It was a good day. 2 weeks later, Dad developed another respiratory infection. The doctor said his swallowing difficulties were making him aspirate food into his lungs. We had to make the difficult decision to insert a feeding tube. Diane somehow found out and called Adult Protective Services, claiming we were starving him. The caseworker, Reese, quickly determined Dad was receiving excellent care and closed the investigation. But the stress of the visit exhausted Dad. That night, with Connor and me sitting beside his bed, Dad squeezed my hand and whispered that he was proud of us both. By morning, he was gone, peaceful in his sleep. Diane showed up at the funeral despite our objections. She wore black and played the grieving widow, but no one was fooled. Connor publicly asked her to leave, and surprisingly, she did without argument. The reading of Dad's will revealed his final message to Diane. He left her his forgiveness, but nothing else. Everything went to Connor and me, with instructions to use some of the money to establish a Parkinson's research fund in his name. It's been 6 months since Dad died. Diane has finally stopped contacting us. Connor thinks she's found someone new to manipulate. I hope whoever it is sees through her faster than Dad did. Connor and I still meet weekly for dinner. We talk about Dad and the good memories before Diane. Sometimes it still hurts, but mostly we're grateful for the time we had with him after getting him away from her. I still have the security cameras up. Old habits die hard. Last night, I woke up to an alert on my phone. The security camera caught movement at my front door at 2 a.m. I checked the footage with my heart racing. It was Diane, standing there for nearly 10 minutes before leaving. She didn't knock or try to get in. She just stood there, staring at the door like she was working up the courage to do something. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across her face, making her appear almost ghost-like on my screen. I didn't tell Connor about it. He's finally starting to move on, and I don't want to drag him back into her drama. Besides, we'd both had enough of her manipulations during Dad's illness. 3 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. No stamp, just my name written in Diane's loopy handwriting. The envelope was slightly perfumed with that cloying jasmine scent she always wore. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. It was 4 pages of her explaining how sorry she was, how much she missed Dad, and how she wanted to make amends with Connor and me. She claimed she was getting therapy and had seen the light about her behavior. The pages were dotted with what looked like tear stains, perfectly placed for maximum emotional effect. At the end, she asked if we could meet for coffee to talk things through. I called Connor immediately. He was quiet when I read him the letter. He said he'd heard this kind of talk from her before, usually when she wanted something. The familiar weariness in his voice took me back to all those family dinners ruined by Diane's sudden mood swings. We agreed to ignore it, hoping she would eventually give up and leave us alone. The next week, Diane showed up at Connor's workplace. His coworker said she was crying and making a scene in the lobby, clutching a framed photo of Dad and telling anyone who would listen about her devastating loss. Connor refused to see her, and security eventually escorted her out. That night, she called me 15 times. I didn't answer, but each ring sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. The calls continued for days. Then came more letters, then emails. She even contacted some of our mutual friends, telling them we were cruelly shutting her out after Dad's death, when all she wanted was to grieve with her family. Some people actually called us to ask why we were being so harsh to a grieving widow. One of Dad's oldest friends, who didn't know the full story of their divorce, left me a voicemail saying he was disappointed in our behavior. Connor and I met for our weekly dinner at the Italian place Dad used to love. Over plates of barely touched pasta, we made a plan. We would meet her once in public with clear boundaries. We'd hear her out but make no promises. If she showed any signs of her old manipulative behavior, we'd leave immediately. Connor looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes matching mine. We chose a busy coffee shop downtown, strategically selecting a table near the exit. Diane arrived 20 minutes early. I watched her through the window, rehearsing what looked like a speech and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She had dressed the part of the grieving widow in a subdued black outfit that I knew she'd never wear by choice. Connor squeezed my hand as we walked in, his palm clammy with nervous sweat. Diane was on her best behavior at first. She cried about how much she missed Dad, carefully wiping away tears before they could ruin her makeup. She apologized for any misunderstandings in the past. She talked about her therapy and her new spiritual journey, dropping names of self-help books and meditation techniques. Then she got to the real reason for all this effort. She wanted us to correct the record with Dad's lawyer about his final wishes. She insisted Dad had promised her the lake house, not Connor, and that there must have been a mistake in the will. Connor calmly reminded her that Dad had changed his will after their divorce, and everything was legal and final. Diane's face changed then. The mask slipped, and I saw the cold, calculating look I remembered from when she was stealing from Dad. Her eyes hardened and her mouth formed that thin line I'd come to dread. She said if we didn't help her, she might have to share some concerning information about Dad's mental state in his final years with her lawyer. We left immediately. Connor was shaking with anger in the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We drove straight to Dad's lawyer's office and warned him about Diane's threats. He assured us the will was solid, especially since Dad had been evaluated by a doctor specifically to prevent these kinds of claims. The lawyer's office felt like a sanctuary, with its leather chairs and bookshelves, a place where Diane's chaos couldn't reach us. 2 weeks later, Diane filed a lawsuit challenging Dad's will. She claimed he wasn't mentally competent when he changed it after their divorce. She had somehow convinced Dad's former home health aide to testify that he seemed confused in his final months. We later discovered she had offered the aide money, preying on her financial struggles after a recent divorce. The lawsuit dragged on for months. We had to share Dad's medical records, private journals, and emails to prove he was sound of mind. It was like losing him all over again, having strangers pick through his personal thoughts and judge his mental capacity. I cried the day they read his journal entries aloud in court, his private reflections on his illness and his hopes for Connor and me after he was gone. During this time, Dad's Parkinson's Research Fund received its first major grant. Connor and I attended the ceremony where they announced the funding for a promising new treatment approach. The research center was filled with doctors and scientists who spoke about Dad with such respect, detailing how his donations had accelerated their work. I wish Dad could have been there to see it. His name was on a plaque in the research center's lobby, the brass letters catching the light as we walked past. Diane tried to attend the ceremony too, but security kept her out based on our prior warning. We spotted her watching from across the street, her face twisted with resentment. The judge finally dismissed Diane's lawsuit. The medical evidence was clear, and Dad's doctors testified that while his body was failing, his mind had remained sharp until near the end. His primary physician described how Dad had discussed current events and complex family matters with perfect clarity just weeks before his death. The judge also ordered Diane to pay our legal fees, which were substantial. We thought that would be the end of it. We were wrong. Diane started showing up at our friends' houses, telling wild stories about how we had manipulated Dad and stolen her rightful inheritance. She created social media accounts dedicated to exposing us, posting old family photos with captions that twisted the truth. She even contacted my boss, claiming I had stolen jewelry from her house during Dad's illness. I had to sit through an uncomfortable meeting explaining the situation, mortified that my professional life was being tainted by her lies. Connor found her sitting in her car outside his apartment one night. When he confronted her, she claimed she just wanted to talk, but he noticed a folder of papers on her passenger seat with my address and work schedule written on them. He took photos with his phone before she drove away, his hands trembling so badly he could barely press the button. We filed for a restraining order the next day. The judge granted it based on the escalating pattern of harassment. Diane was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from us, our homes, and our workplaces. The courthouse felt cold and impersonal, but I felt a wave of relief when the judge signed the order. For a few weeks, things were quiet. Then Connor called me in a panic. Someone had broken into his apartment while he was at work. Nothing valuable was taken, but his photo albums of Dad were missing, along with Dad's old watch that Connor had inherited. We knew it was Diane, but couldn't prove it. The thought of her hands on those precious memories made me physically ill. The police took a report but didn't seem very interested. They said without evidence there wasn't much they could do. I upgraded my security system and gave Connor a spare key to my place if he ever felt unsafe. We started checking in with each other multiple times a day, a new routine born of shared anxiety. A month later, we received unexpected news. Diane had been arrested for breaking into the home of her new boyfriend's ex-wife. She had been caught on camera stealing personal items and planting hidden recording devices. The boyfriend, who we later learned was a recently widowed man she'd met at a grief support group, broke things off immediately. The police report described items in her possession that matched Connor's missing mementos. With Diane facing criminal charges and the restraining order still in place, we finally had some peace. Connor and I focused on honoring Dad's memory in positive ways. We volunteered at a Parkinson's walk, donated books to Dad's favorite library, and took a trip to the mountains where we used to vacation as a family before Diane came into the picture. Standing on the same overlook where Dad had taught us to identify bird calls, I felt his presence more strongly than I had since since his funeral. Dad's disease had progressed quickly in his final year. The tremors got worse, and he needed help with basic tasks. But he never complained. He told us he was grateful for the time he had reclaimed after leaving Diane, even if it was shorter than we'd all hoped. He said those last 2 years were worth more than the 10 he'd spent under Diane's control. I remember his smile the day we moved him into his new apartment, how he ran his fingers along the walls and said, "This place is just mine. No bad memories here. I still check my security cameras every morning. Old habits really do die hard. But these days, I'm not looking for Diane. I'm just making sure the world stays outside where it belongs while I keep Dad's memory safe inside. Sometimes I wonder what Dad would think of me now. It's been 3 years since he passed. The Parkinson's took him faster than any of us expected, but those last few years after Diane were the happiest I'd seen him since Mom died. The divorce was surprisingly quick once we got the right lawyer. Joseph Winters was a pit bull in a suit who specialized in cases involving financial abuse. His reputation preceded him. Silver-haired with piercing blue eyes that seemed to detect lies before they were even spoken. He helped Dad document everything. The forged signatures on bank withdrawals, the hidden accounts in offshore banks, the gifts Diane had pressured him to give her family members. Dad's medical records showing his early Parkinson's diagnosis that Diane had hidden from everyone sealed the deal. She'd known about his condition for nearly a year before any of us did, all while systematically draining his retirement accounts. The judge wasn't just sympathetic. She was furious. I'll never forget her face when she ordered Diane to return every penny plus interest. Her normally composed judicial demeanor cracked as she leaned forward, speaking directly to Diane about predatory behavior toward a vulnerable adult. Diane lost the house, the cars, even the jewelry she'd bought with Dad's money. She walked out of that courtroom with less than she'd had when she met him, clutching her designer purse like it might be taken next. Connor was there that day. He sat behind his mother but refused to speak to her. His face remained stoic throughout the proceedings, but I noticed his hands trembling slightly, the same way Dad's had started to. After the ruling, he walked straight to Dad, hugged him, and apologized for not seeing what was happening sooner. Dad just patted his back and told him none of it was his fault. "Family is complicated," Dad whispered, loud enough that I could hear. "But you did the right thing in the end. We thought that would be the end of it. We were wrong." The calls started a month later, first to Dad, then to me when he wouldn't answer. Diane crying, begging for forgiveness, claiming she'd changed. Her voice would shift from tearful remorse to calculated sweetness within the same conversation. When that didn't work, she switched tactics. She told neighbors Dad had dementia and we were taking advantage of him. She showed up at his doctor appointments claiming to be his caretaker, wearing scrubs as if she worked in healthcare. She even contacted his bank pretending to be concerned about unusual activity on his accounts, trying to trigger fraud investigations that would freeze his assets. Connor became our unexpected ally. He warned us whenever Diane was planning something. He intercepted the letter she tried to send to Adult Protective Services claiming Dad was being abused. He deleted the fake social media accounts she created to spread rumors about us. He even installed security cameras at Dad's apartment when we discovered she'd somehow made a copy of the key. "She's always been like this," Connor told me one night over coffee at the all-night diner near Dad's place. The fluorescent lights highlighted the dark circles under his eyes. When something doesn't go her way, she tries to burn everything down. He looked tired, older than his 25 years. "I love her because she's my mom, but I can't let her hurt more people." He stirred his coffee absently, watching the cream swirl. "She did this to my dad too, before she met yours. It's a pattern." Dad's symptoms got worse that winter. The tremors spread to both hands. His balance became unreliable. He fell twice in 1 week, thankfully without serious injury. His voice, once commanding in the courtroom where he'd practiced law for 30 years, became softer, sometimes slurring by evening. The neurologist adjusted his medications, but we all knew where this was heading. Still, Dad seemed at peace. He spent his days reading books he'd always wanted to read, watching old movies from his childhood, and teaching me to cook his favorite recipes while he could still manage it. "Pay attention to the garlic," he'd say, demonstrating how to crush it with the flat of a knife despite his trembling hands. "It's the soul of the dish." Diane somehow found out about Dad's declining health. She showed up at his apartment unannounced, all sympathy and concern, wearing a cashmere sweater in his favorite shade of blue. I arrived for my daily visit to find her sitting in Dad's living room, holding his shaking hand. The look on Dad's face, confusion mixed with fear, made my blood boil. The half-empty teacup in front of him had lipstick on the rim, her signature red. I asked her to leave. She refused, her smile never reaching her eyes. I threatened to call the police. She smiled and said she was just visiting an old friend. Dad finally spoke up, his voice soft but firm, telling her he wanted her to go. The look of hatred she gave him before walking out made me install additional security cameras that same day. I also changed the locks, though part of me wondered how many copies of the key already existed. The next attack came through Connor. Diane told him Dad had secretly contacted her, saying he was being isolated and wanted to see her but was afraid of me. She showed Connor fabricated text messages as proof. Connor didn't believe her, but he was worried enough to check. Dad laughed when Connor mentioned it, saying the only thing he was afraid of was running out of his favorite ice cream. "Butter pecan," he said, winking at Connor. "Your sister thinks it's too sweet, but what does she know?" As Dad's mobility decreased, we converted the ground floor of my house into an accessible apartment for him. Connor helped with the renovations, installing grab bars and widening doorways. He took a week off work to help paint the walls Dad's favorite shade of sage green. Dad moved in just before his 68th birthday. We had a small party, just me, Dad, Connor, and a few close friends from Dad's law practice. Dad's hands shook so badly he couldn't cut his cake, but his smile was genuine when I helped him. Best birthday in years, he whispered as we looked at old family photos later that evening. Diane sent a birthday card with a check for $5,000. Dad tore up both without opening the envelope. Connor recognized his mother's handwriting and told us later she'd been telling people she was supporting Dad financially through his illness. Another lie to make herself look generous. She'd even joined a support group for caregivers of Parkinson's patients, sharing tearful stories about her devotion to her husband. The worst came 6 months later. Dad fell in the bathroom and couldn't get up. I was at work, and the medical alert button we'd gotten him had fallen off his wrist. He lay there for nearly 2 hours before I came home for lunch and found him, cold and frightened but trying to make jokes about his situation. Somehow, Diane found out about the fall, probably from someone at the hospital where Dad was treated for a broken hip. She filed an emergency petition for guardianship, claiming Dad was unable to care for himself, and I was neglecting him. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Connor testified against his own mother, bringing records of her previous financial abuse and evidence of the care setup we had for Dad. Dad's doctors confirmed I was following all their recommendations. The judge dismissed Diane's petition and warned her about filing false claims. As we left the courtroom, Diane hissed at Connor, "You'll regret choosing them over your own mother." He didn't respond, just offered his arm to Dad as we walked to the car. Dad's health declined rapidly after that. The Parkinson's affected his swallowing, then his speech. Connor visited almost daily, reading to Dad when Dad could no longer hold books steady. I took family leave from work to be his full-time caregiver. Through it all, Dad never complained. He communicated with his eyes when words failed him. Gratitude, love, occasional frustration, but never self-pity. On good days, we'd sit in the garden, Dad pointing at birds he could no longer name but still recognized. Diane made one last attempt to insert herself into our lives. She sent a lawyer with paperwork she claimed Dad had signed, giving her medical power of attorney. The signature was clearly forged. Dad's hands had been too unsteady for months to sign anything legibly. The lawyer apologized when I showed him Dad's actual medical directives and left without further argument. Later, Connor told me she'd paid the lawyer in jewelry she'd somehow kept hidden during the divorce. Dad passed peacefully in his sleep last spring. Connor sat with me at the funeral, a buffer between me and Diane, who showed up in black looking appropriately devastated for someone who had lost the love of her life. She carried a handkerchief monogrammed with Dad's initials, dabbing at dry eyes whenever anyone looked her way. She tried to speak at the service, but Connor gently led her back to her seat, whispering something that made her stay quiet. After everyone left, Connor helped me sort through Dad's things. We found a letter Dad had written before his hands got too bad, addressed to both of us. He thanked Connor for standing up for what was right, even when it meant standing against his mother. He thanked me for giving him back his dignity. He wrote that his last years were his best because he spent them surrounded by love instead of fear. Diane still tries occasionally. Last month, she sent me a text saying she found some of Dad's old photos she thought I might want. I didn't respond. Connor told me later it was just another attempt to get her foot in the door. I've moved on as best I can. Dad's apartment in my house is now Connor's whenever he needs a place to stay. We've formed our own kind of family. Not the one I expected, but one built on loyalty and truth rather than manipulation and lies. Sometimes when I'm cooking Dad's garlic chicken recipe, I can almost hear him telling me I'm using too much salt, and I smile, knowing he'd be proud of the family we've become. Last night, Connor and I went through some of Dad's old photo albums. We found pictures from before Diane, when it was just the three of us, Dad, me, and Mom. Connor asked about my mother, and I told him everything I could remember. Her cinnamon-scented perfume, her habit of singing off-key while cooking Sunday breakfast, the way she'd tuck notes into my lunchbox. It felt good to share those memories, watching Connor's face light up as he discovered this part of our family history he'd never known. Dad's divorce from Diane finalized 6 months ago. His lawyer, Mr. Jenkins, a stern man with kind eyes who'd been Dad's friend since college, helped him recover most of his assets. Dad was smart. He had kept detailed records of everything Diane had manipulated him into signing over during those years when his illness made him vulnerable. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with silver hair, ruled decisively in his favor, and Diane ended up with less than she started with. She lost the sprawling Victorian house she'd convinced Dad to put in her name, the 2 luxury cars, and access to Dad's substantial retirement funds. Dad didn't even want revenge. He just wanted what was rightfully his, what he'd worked 40 years to build. Dad moved back into the main house with me after the divorce. His Parkinson's was getting worse, but he managed with medication and physical therapy 3 times a week at the clinic downtown. Some days were better than others. On good days, he'd help me in the garden, his hands steady enough to plant the tomato seedlings he loved, or play chess with Connor, still sharp enough to win most games. On bad days, he mostly rested and read books, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, a blanket across his lap even in summer. We thought we were done with Diane, but we were wrong. She started calling Dad constantly, switching between begging for money and threatening to spread lies about him. Her voice would shift from tearful to venomous in seconds. Dad blocked her number after the 15th call in 2 days. Then she started showing up at our house unannounced, pounding on the door, peering through windows. We had to get a restraining order, which meant another draining day in court, watching Dad try to hide his tremors as he testified. Connor was caught in the middle. He loved his mother but couldn't ignore how she was acting. He visited her once a month at a coffee shop, neutral ground where neither could feel trapped. He told us she was living in a small apartment across town and working at Macy's in the perfume department. She always asked about Dad's health and our finances, fishing for information with practiced casualness. Connor never told her anything important, deflecting with vague reassurances that we were all fine. 3 months after the divorce, Diane created fake social media accounts pretending to be Dad's old friends. She used these to spread rumors that Dad had stolen money from his company before retiring. The posts were cleverly written, with just enough specific details to seem credible. Dad's former coworkers called to check if he was okay. We had to explain the situation to everyone, watching Dad's face crumple with each call. Dad's old boss, Mr. Thompson, knew Dad would never steal and helped clear his name, sending a company-wide email defending Dad's character and 40 years of impeccable service. Dad's tremors got worse in the fall. The doctor, a specialist with gentle hands and a straightforward manner, increased his medication, but it made him dizzy and nauseous. He fell once in the bathroom, the crash of his body against the tile floor still haunting my dreams. Thankfully, I was home and heard him call for help, his voice thin with pain and embarrassment. After that, we installed grab bars, a shower seat, and non-slip mats throughout the house. Connor stayed with us more often to help out, sleeping on the sofa in the den so he could hear if Dad needed anything during the night. Diane somehow found out about Dad's worsening condition, probably from questioning Connor too carefully. She showed up at his doctor's office during an appointment, wearing a conservative outfit and her concerned wife expression. She claimed to be his wife, speaking with such conviction that the receptionist, new and unaware of the situation, almost believed her. The receptionist called me and I rushed over, heart pounding. Diane was telling the doctor she should be making Dad's medical decisions. I showed the doctor their divorce papers and the restraining order, my hands shaking almost as badly as Dad's. Diane was escorted out by security, hurling accusations all the way to the parking lot. Next, she tried to contact Dad's bank. She claimed Dad wasn't mentally competent to manage his finances anymore, and that she should be given access as his caretaker. The bank manager, who had known Dad for years, called Dad to verify, and we shut down her attempt quickly. Dad added me as a co-signer on his accounts just to be safe, his signature wobbly but determined on the bank forms. Winter came, and Dad's health declined further. The tremors spread to both hands, and his balance problems got worse. He moved into the downstairs guest room because the stairs became too difficult, even with the banister we'd installed. Connor installed a ramp at the front door for Dad's walker, spending a whole weekend measuring, sawing, and hammering, determined to make it perfect. Diane's next move was truly awful. She called Adult Protective Services and reported that I was abusing Dad and stealing his money. A social worker named Jamie, with tired eyes and a compassionate smile, came to investigate. She interviewed Dad privately, looked around our home, and checked our financial records. Jamie quickly determined the report was false and documented everything in case Diane tried again. She gave us her direct number just in case. Dad was furious about Diane's accusation. He wrote a letter to Diane's boss at the department store, explaining her harassment in painstaking detail, his handwriting growing more illegible as his anger and tremors increased. I don't know if he ever sent it. He just needed to get his anger out on paper, the words a poor substitute for the confrontation his failing body wouldn't allow. By spring, Dad needed more help. We hired a part-time nurse named Michael who came 3 days a week, his cheerful efficiency brightening our increasingly medical home. Michael taught me how to help Dad with his exercises and how to make eating easier when his hands shook badly, showing me how to adapt utensils and prepare foods that maintained Dad's dignity. Dad liked Michael because they shared an interest in baseball, spending hours discussing historic games and controversial calls. Connor graduated from college that May with honors in engineering. Dad was determined to attend the ceremony despite his health. We got a wheelchair with special cushions and arranged for special seating near the stage. Dad beamed with pride watching Connor accept his diploma, tears streaming down his face unnoticed. Diane was there too, seated far from us in a flashy red dress. She tried to approach after the ceremony, but Connor firmly told her it wasn't the time or place, his voice low but resolute. He promised to meet her for coffee the next day instead, a promise I could see he dreaded keeping. At that coffee meeting, Diane told Connor she was moving to Arizona for a fresh start. Connor was relieved but suspicious, knowing his mother's patterns too well. A week later, we discovered she hadn't moved at all. She was renting an apartment just a few blocks from our house, using a different name. The landlord recognized Dad from a photo and called to warn us, uncomfortable with the deception he'd uncovered. Summer brought more challenges. Dad's speech became slurred, making communication difficult. I bought a letterboard to help him express himself when words failed, and we developed a system of gestures and expressions that became our private language. Despite everything, he kept his sense of humor. When I made his favorite garlic chicken and actually used too much salt, he pointed to the salt shaker and then gave me a thumbs down, laughing silently, his eyes crinkling with mirth. Diane's final attempt to insert herself into our lives came in September. She filed a lawsuit claiming Dad had promised to provide for her financially for life. She produced emails that appeared to be from Dad, but the dates were from times when his Parkinson's was so bad he couldn't type or even use a computer. The case was dismissed when her evidence was proven fake, the judge's rebuke scathing and public. Connor finally reached his breaking point with his mother. He told her he couldn't have a relationship with her until she got professional help and stopped trying to hurt us. He said he loved her but couldn't watch her destroy herself and others. Diane cried and promised to change, but Connor had heard those promises before, in childhood after broken promises, in adolescence after embarrassing scenes, in adulthood after manipulations revealed. Dad's condition worsened rapidly in October. The doctor said the disease was progressing faster than expected, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he delivered the news. We set up hospice care at home. Dad was clear that he wanted to stay in his house until the end, surrounded by his books and the garden he could now only see through the window. Friends and former colleagues visited to say goodbye. Dad couldn't speak much, but his eyes showed he understood everything. Connor took a leave from his new job to spend more time with us. We sat with Dad, read to him, and played his favorite music, jazz standards that sometimes made his fingers tap in rhythm, even when he couldn't control them otherwise. On a quiet November morning, with the first snow falling outside his window, Dad passed away peacefully. Connor and I were both holding his hands. His last coherent words the day before had been, "Proud of you both." forced out with tremendous effort, but perfectly clear. We held a small funeral. Diane didn't show up, which was a relief. Dad was buried next to my mother, just as he had wanted, in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town where they'd first met. A week after the funeral, Connor found a letter Dad had written to him months earlier, hidden in his chest set. Dad had asked Connor to look after me, saying we were family now. Connor moved into Dad's apartment permanently after that, bringing his engineering books and his quiet, steady presence. Diane sent flowers to the house after hearing about Dad's death. The card said she was sorry for everything. Connor and I didn't respond. Some wounds are too deep for simple apologies. Some bridges too thoroughly burned to rebuild. Life moved on, even with Dad's absence weighing on us. Connor and I fell into a routine. He worked on his engineering degree while I finished high school. We kept Dad's apartment, using the insurance money to cover rent. Connor managed our finances carefully, making sure we had enough to get by. Sometimes I'd catch him at the kitchen table late at night, calculator in hand, forehead creased with concentration as he balanced our budget. 3 months after Dad died, we received a thick envelope from his lawyer. Inside were documents showing Dad had divorced Diane just before his Parkinson's took a sharp turn. He'd been smarter than Diane realized. Working quietly with his lawyer, he'd documented her manipulation and recovered nearly everything she'd taken. The paperwork showed he'd transferred his assets back into his name, leaving Diane with almost nothing. Connor read through the papers with a small smile. He told me Dad had mentioned working on something important, but never shared the details. The lawyer's note explained that Dad wanted to protect what would be left for me. He hadn't done it out of revenge, but to secure my future. We thought that would be the end of Diane in our lives. We were wrong. The first call came a week later. Diane claimed she was homeless and needed help. Connor listened politely but refused. He told me afterward that his mother had always been dramatic, and she had family she could stay with. We changed our phone number the next day. Then she showed up at our door. Her expensive clothes were gone, replaced by plain jeans and a worn sweater. She begged to talk, saying she'd changed. Connor stood firm, telling her to leave. I watched from behind him, seeing the cold calculation in her eyes even as she cried. Connor saw it too and closed the door on her pleas. The real trouble started when Diane began spreading stories. She contacted my school counselor, claiming Connor was mistreating me. The counselor called me in for a meeting, asking careful questions about my home life. I explained the truth, showing her the legal documents naming Connor as my guardian. The counselor seemed satisfied, but the damage was beginning. Diane moved into an apartment in our building. We'd see her in the hallway or lobby, always ready with a sad smile or a comment about how much she missed us. Connor warned me not to engage with her. He knew her patterns better than anyone. She started telling neighbors that Connor had stolen her money and turned me against her. Some believed her. We received cold looks in the elevator and whispers in the laundry room. Mrs. Abernathy, who had always saved cookies for me, now hurried past with a tight-lipped nod. Connor ignored it all, focusing on his studies and taking care of me. One night, we came home to find our door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but things had been moved slightly. My photo albums were open on the coffee table. Connor called a locksmith that night. We never could prove it was Diane, but we both knew. The worst came when Diane contacted my grandparents, Dad's parents. They hadn't been close with Dad after his marriage to Diane, but they still cared. Diane told them Connor was using Dad's money for himself, not for my care. My grandparents called, concerned. It took weeks of conversations and sharing bank statements before they understood the truth. Through it all, Dad's condition worsened in my memories. I'd dream of him, his hands shaking more violently than they ever had in life. In these dreams, his face would contort with pain he'd hidden from me when alive. Connor would find me crying in the morning and sit with me, not saying much, just being there. His quiet strength reminded me of Dad. Connor graduated with his engineering degree that spring. He got a job at a local firm, working long hours but making good money. I started looking at colleges, knowing Dad would have wanted me to go. Connor insisted we use the money Dad had protected for my education. Diane's attempts to hurt us continued but became more desperate. She left notes under our door claiming Connor was just like her, manipulative and selfish. She cornered me once in the grocery store, her fingers digging into my arm as she told me Dad had confided in her, that he regretted making Connor my guardian. I walked away without a word, but her fingertips left red marks that took hours to fade. Connor never spoke badly about Diane to me, despite everything. Once, when I asked why he didn't hate her, he said simply that hating her would give her power over him. He acknowledged her actions but refused to let them consume him. It was a maturity I admired and tried to learn from. 2 years after Dad died, Diane made her final attempt. She filed a legal petition claiming Dad had been mentally incompetent when he divorced her and transferred his assets. The case went nowhere. Dad's doctor provided records showing he had been mentally sharp until the very end, despite his physical decline. The judge dismissed her claim and warned her about filing frivolous lawsuits. After that, Diane moved away. We heard through Connor's aunt that she'd gone to Florida to live with a cousin. The relief was immediate, like a weight lifted from both our shoulders. That night, we ordered pizza and watched a comedy marathon, laughing more freely than we had in months. I graduated high school and started college. Connor dated occasionally but stayed focused on his career and checking in on me. We talked about Dad often, remembering his laugh and his terrible jokes. The pain of losing him never fully disappeared, but it softened with time, like a photograph fading around the edges while the image remained clear. In my sophomore year of college, I got a call from Connor. Dad's Parkinson's medication had been part of a research study. The pharmaceutical company had found some irregularities in their data and was reviewing patient outcomes. They wanted to interview families of patients who had participated. Connor and I met with the researchers together. They asked detailed questions about Dad's symptoms and progression. At the end, they thanked us for our time. A A month later, we received a letter explaining that while Dad's medication hadn't caused any harm, it hadn't provided the benefits they'd hoped for. The study was being discontinued. It was a small thing, but it brought Dad back to the center of our thoughts. That night, Connor and I played chess using Dad's old set. The carved wooden pieces were smooth from years of handling, each one carrying the memory of Dad's touch. Connor had taught me the game over the years, and though I wasn't as good as either of them, I enjoyed the connection to Dad it gave me. As we played, Connor told me he was considering buying a house. The apartment held too many memories, both good and bad. I agreed it was time for a change. We started looking at properties the following weekend, driving through neighborhoods with coffee cups in hand, imagining new beginnings. 3 years after Dad died, we received a small package from Florida. Inside was Dad's watch, the one Diane had taken when she left him. There was no note, no explanation. Connor examined it carefully, making sure it was really Dad's. It was, right down to the scratch on the back from when Dad had caught it on a doorframe. The leather strap was worn in exactly the places where Dad's wrist had shaped it over years of wear. Connor gave the watch to me. I wore it to my college graduation the following year, feeling Dad's presence as I accepted my diploma. Connor cheered loudly from the audience, embarrassing me in exactly the way Dad would have. We never heard from Diane again. Whatever prompted her to return the watch remained her secret. Connor suggested that perhaps, in her own way, she had finally accepted defeat, or maybe found a small piece of remorse. Life settled into a new normal. Connor met Sarah, an architect with a quick laugh and kind eyes. I finished graduate school and started my career. We stayed close, having dinner together every Sunday, often cooking Dad's favorite recipes from the handwritten cards he'd kept in a tin box. 5 years after Dad died, Connor called me on a random Tuesday. He'd been going through some old papers and found a letter Dad had written to both of us, separate from the one he'd hidden in the chess set. It was dated just days before he died. In it, Dad wrote that he was proud of both of us. He thanked Connor for being the son he'd never had, and me for being his greatest joy. He said that family isn't always blood, but it's always love. His hands must have been shaking badly when he wrote it. The letters uneven and sometimes hard to read, but his message was clear. We were his legacy, not his possessions or his money. What mattered to him was that we had each other, and we did.